I'm just going to try to unmute your phone. Thanks to everyone who joined. We're going to get started in a second.
I unmuted my computer, but not my phone. Still perfecting my technique here. Okay, it's 1 minute after high noon, and I am delighted to welcome so many people to the third in our series called Expert Insights and Leading Through the COVID-19 Crisis. We are going to continue this series at least through the month of April. This is the third, as I said, and we are really happy to have so many participants. One thing I want to say before we get into today's material is that we do have the chat line open for you to type in, and we'd really love to know why you're here and what your key questions are. So we've got that line open up, and our goal is to be really responsive because there are so many aspects to this crisis. We are dealing with topics that affect you personally and professionally, and how those kind of sometimes blend together in this big of a crisis. So anything is fair game. Please feel free to just, ask us questions that we may be able to get to this time, or we'll put onto the list for the things we address in our future sessions. For today, we're going to focus more on the professional side, where we're going to pick up on some of the ideas that we introduced in our first two sessions. We're going to talk about ways in which you can get kind of more control over your situation, and Sarah's going to take the lead on that. And then we're going to talk about how you build teams to address the crisis and moving out of the crisis. And we're going to address that through an interview. Today I have Sarah Matusik with me, and also my colleague Emily George, who is joining us from the middle of the country, Missouri. So now we have covered almost all the geographic bases. And Emily will say more about herself as we get into the interview section. So just a quick recap. We have introduced in the first two sessions a couple of frameworks. They are online. Maria, who is staffing our call, will put the links up on the chat feature. But we introduced two frameworks, one to explain how a crisis of this magnitude, a landscape scale crisis as we're calling it, what the stages of that crisis are. And at this point, we're really moving from response and into the management stage of the crisis. So that's the global landscape. And then we introduced a framework of grieving, which is familiar to many people, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grieving, and how that is what we are experiencing individually, most likely, as we go through the stages of this landscape crisis. So those two models are on our slides from before. And just wanted to remind you that we have that framework there. And then we're building from that with our management response. So compassion, connection, and control. Those are the 3 C's that we're talking about. And we spent a lot of time in the last couple of sessions talking about a compassionate response and how to stay connected. And today we want to talk about control. So that's my intro. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, who is going to bring back a concept from last week's session and then build upon that. Sarah.
Great, thank you. Just wave if you can't hear me. I'm assuming this is working. So last week I introduced a mindset concept to you that we had actually brought in verbally in the first session, and we brought to you this visual of a circle on the inside of things that you can control and a square on the outside that includes things that you cannot control. This week, we'd like to take this one step further and introduce the phases of mindset and control, such that we think that it's helpful to do an additional exercise thinking about where is the space in between these things that you can and can't control. Maria, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the spheres of control include, again, a circle on the inside of things that you can control. I've got here your attitude, media intake, and motivational levels as just a couple of examples. And you still have that box on the outside of things that you really cannot control that we're actually labeling here things that you're concerned about because you are concerned about the things that you can't control. You just can't control them. And then in the inside of this, donut shape here is influence. And that's things that you can influence. So you can do something that will influence the things that you're concerned about, but you don't necessarily have full control over the outcome of that influence. So for example, who you vote for, where you travel, the things that you say, those are things that you can influence. And there's even a little bit of a gray area between control and influence, because the way that you, for example, do media intake in your life, especially right now, is very important. We highly recommend that people take in media that is of high quality, that has some, scientific or healthcare backing instead of just opinion pieces. And we also recommend getting an international perspective in your media intake. And if you do those things, then the things that you influence become influenced in turn by that media intake that you do. So your attitude can be changed by those things as well. So it's all very connected in a nice web. And what I found to be helpful this week is actually filling this in and thinking about, what do I actually have full control over, and what can I influence, and then what am I just concerned about? And then taking that and putting it into the organizational perspective is also helpful. So there's with everything, there's this balance. There's a personal life balance, and then there's an organization or work balance. And thinking about things that you have control of in your work, in the work that you do in your organization, whether you're a leader or not, and then where you can influence. And influence is this critical word. There are books and articles and many things that have been written about the term lateral leadership, or influencing without authority, sometimes it's called. And we at Bay Health have done trainings on these issues for teams that have a lot of responsibility but do not have direct authority or control over the outcomes of what other teams are doing, or other groups are doing, or even other organizations are doing. And so there are things that you can learn and skills that you can build to really understand this concept really well, and then understand how you can do things and you can control things to gain that influence in a positive way. So we recommend that folks take a minute or two to go through this exercise this week, to build on hopefully what you did last week, was just to be kind of stewing and thinking about what you do and don't have control over. And do it on a personal level, do it related to the COVID crisis, but also do it on an organizational level, because it can really start you thinking about where you can influence and where you can do things that will make a difference without having full control over those things. All right, so I'm going to switch gears now. We're going to move into the next section of our webinar today. So I'm going to introduce Emily George. You can see her face here. She is our senior consultant, has been with us for a number of months, and is a nurse by training, but also has many, many years of public health training and experience and expertise. She's actually working on her doctorate right now in public health related to leadership and change champions and change agents, which I think is extremely relevant right now. So Emily is going to be doing our expert interview with Rosemarie, our founder and CEO, and I'll let her introduce this concept before she moves into the questions. But we do want to mention that two things. One, Emily is the producer of our podcast. And so if you want to check out that podcast, she does most of the interviews on it of late, and is producing the whole thing, and that's on Healthcare Radio now. And it's called Unlocking Accountable Care. So a little plug there. And the second thing is that I have it written down here. Sorry about this. Second thing is, I can't remember. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Emily. Thank you so much.
I think you wanted to just reintroduce the slide that orients us towards this notion of a network of teams.
Oh, yeah, exactly, yeah. So we brought this slide to you last week, so many of you should be familiar with it. It's a framework of leading in a landscape level crisis, which is a global crisis. And so we have this third one outlined related to teams and networks of teams. And so Emily's interview with Rosemarie today is going to be guiding her through talking about this very concept, which is critically important right now, especially. All right, take it away, Emily. Can't hear you.
Let's see, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Is that
Is
better?
that better?
Yep.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And wait, you can hear me? Okay. Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. And we are so excited to have this opportunity to speak with our founder and CEO, Rosemarie Day. And the reason we really wanted to highlight her and get her advice on managing teams and crises is because Rosemarie has a tremendous amount of rich experience leading teams through the 9/11 crisis, as well as the recession that took place in 2008. And we thought that her experience would be very relevant for many of us who are leading teams as well during this time. And so I want to just start off with asking you, Rosemarie, when crisis struck in the past, when you've been leading these teams, where did you start and what did you do with your teams first?
Well, thanks very much, Emily. It's fun to be interviewed. I actually cut my first big crisis that I cut my teeth on. I don't know that I was 30 years old yet. My task was to help lead the response in state government to the findings of asbestos in one of our large state office buildings that had 2,000 employees in it. And it had been some asbestos, a little bit had been discovered. The question was there more? Were employees at risk? And would we actually have to empty that building extremely rapidly? And so, it was a health concern. There were so many aspects of that crisis, and it was unprecedented in terms of what had happened in any building of that size, at least in the state portfolio. So as I said, I don't think I was even 30 yet, and I was tasked with the response to that, to organizing that response. And when I went back to think about how I've led through other crises, I realized that what I learned in that first one, when things were just felt at the time like they were on fire, was literally seared into my practices going forward. And now I see articles written about all of this, and it's like really what I learned in that first time. So the most important thing really is to build a team, a crisis response team. And depending on the magnitude of the crisis and the size of your organization, that may actually be a network of teams and not just one team. But you've got to at least have a core group that is tasked with crisis response. And it actually needs to be different people from who's typically inhabiting the C-suite. So a CEO has got to keep their organization going. And the folks inhabiting the C-suite are, usually tremendously talented and accomplished, and they also have tremendously large day jobs. So it's difficult for the organization to keep going if you then pull that group fully into crisis response. What you've got to do is identify some people at other levels, and maybe one person from the C-suite, but really try to identify that talent that may be a few levels down, but has expertise that pertains to this crisis. So expertise and the kind of flexible, adaptive personality that can keep a certain amount of level-headedness and focus as you move through the crisis. So there's a bit of a personality. If you can choose how you build this team, there's a kind of aptitude aspect and an experience base that you're looking for. And the experience base is really important because there's no time for learning curves. You really want to be able to tap people who are immersed in an area of knowledge. So I'll give an example here where this whole thing of telework and Zoom meetings and things of that nature, the expertise of how to conduct that may be lower down in your organization. It may be some of your newer employees who are very tech savvy combined with somebody who has deep experience in HR, and they may be kind of the node who can help you figure out how to be most productive in this really challenging time through the mode of telework. So that's just one example, but the expertise, as I say, sometimes organizations get so hierarchical and you get into this mindset that it's only the people at the top who really know the stuff, and you've got to break through that and find the folks who have the expertise that's relevant to this particular crisis. So forming that team, not making it too big because it's got to be flexible and adaptable. It may, grow in size and then shrink depending on what's happening, in that any given month. But it's building that team and thinking beyond that original kind of C-suite level.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I would imagine that you would have to, as a leader, really be tapped into those unique skill sets of your team, and so I imagine you would have to do that rapidly, like you said, and really draw on the competencies of those individuals. Can you describe how you really did that and how you leveraged the different team members' expertise when you were building out those teams? You gave a small example, but could you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so I think there's always a certain amount of humility you've got to have, that there's just no way any one person, CEO otherwise, can know everything. And particularly as we keep using that word, unprecedented. This is such an unprecedented set of circumstances. So you have to, let others lead from their areas of expertise. And that is sometimes uncomfortable for people who are closer to the top. But it's really necessary, because you've got to have people who are closer to some of the knowledge, or, front lines, as it were, who can be freed up from part of their usual day job to just focus on this, to the media inputs that Sarah talked about, to really pay attention, have somebody dedicated to what's the international situation look like with the countries that are 2 or 3 weeks ahead of us in this crisis. You want to have somebody who can be expert on that and feeding that information back into the core team. Those are the kinds of things that you've got to allow yourself to not be necessarily, as the leader, the expert on all things, and trust. You have to build a high trust kind of environment so that people are empowered to lead from where they are within the context of these new crisis response teams.
Wow, that's really helpful to think about. And you mentioned the word. Go ahead.
I think it might go without saying, but I'm assuming folks realize that crisis response team is very multidisciplinary. So I gave the example of, somebody who understands tech stuff in the context of telework and an HR person. But you also want to have folks who understand science and health matters so that they can interpret that. I know a really critical person we had on one of our teams was somebody who was skilled in risk communication. So how is it that you take the data that you know and not communicate it in an inflammatory or scary way, but in a really, smart, clear, trustworthy way that is honest with people about what the risks are, but doesn't, again, get inflammatory and scare people unnecessarily. That's a real skill and talent, and having somebody like that on your team, sometimes CEOs are trained in that, but a lot of times they aren't, and that's okay, because you can designate somebody to be that communicator. And I think we see that, with Dr. Fauci on the, from the CDC in terms of the role that he's playing. And so it's like that within your organization.
That's a great point. I think it's interesting too how sometimes those skill sets lie buried in people and they come out in the midst of crisis. And so sometimes with teams, I'm sure you've seen and you've described a little bit of emergence in some of these skills and expertise that you may not have seen if the crisis wouldn't have struck. You mentioned the word focus several times, and I'm curious if you could describe how have you kept your teams focused when there's so much distraction or inflammatory language? What are some practical ways that you kept them focused on the right things during this time?
So I think something that we've talked about in previous weeks around communication and having, honestly, like a consistent structure of so we've encouraged CEOs to have a time that you communicate regularly, even if you don't think you've got something to say, but everybody can count on the fact that at 8 a.m. or at noon or whatever, you're going to be there and you're going to be able to say what you can say in that day or in that week. It's really similar with the teams. I found that if we had a daily check-in, that was going to be that first thing in the morning, so whatever had transpired, we knew we were going to get together. We didn't have to waste time scheduling or whatever. That was like our convening time. We also initially really tried to do stuff in person. Now, obviously, that's not possible right now, but creating that space where we could frankly build some trust and relationship because we were going to be having to rely on each other so heavily. We needed that time, FaceTime, which we can do via Zoom and breakout groups, to build some of that quickly. And so doing that in a structured setting, so there's always going to be a daily meeting, or maybe it's a couple times a day, beginning of the day, end of the day, it depends, that you have that kind of safety and security almost of that structure. And then people know, okay, I've got to, be ready for that meeting. I've got to have my top 3 issues, to bring to that meeting. And so it helps people then to focus how they're going to triage all the stuff that's coming in and bring something to those meetings that you're having. So I'm a fan of structure to a certain extent, because I think it does provide some of that clarity and ability, it becomes like a focus and action focusing event. So that's one part of my answer. I think people also have to engage and be encouraged to engage in that kind of self-care and be aware of that information overload. We keep talking about that, but some of that can just become paralyzing. And so you've got to, again, be able to triage and also take some breaks, even if you're on that crisis response team, because you've got to be able to stay focused, keep breathing and keep perspective.
I would love to have you talk a little bit more about how you promoted some of that self-care and how you managed maybe the limitations of others that you saw coming forth when you were having these daily huddles. What were some things that you did to promote that?
It's interesting. I think back then, when I remember those crises, they were a little bit different in that they weren't landscape scale like this is. So it wasn't like the folks on the team also had to go home and had to be at home homeschooling or suddenly caring for remote aging relatives or all of those things. Like that makes this that much harder. And I'm also further along in life understanding how important self-care is. So I can't say that I did that in a super great way at the time. It was kind of like, okay, we just need people who are ready, willing, and able. I think with this crisis, we're really, as a team here, trying to emphasize that even folks who are usually ready, willing, and able are going to need to be cut some slack in this time because there's just too much on all of our plates. And so I think there has to be some compassion and understanding for that. That said, if somebody's got way too much on their plate that they really can't, necessarily show up and need leave time, they're not a good candidate for the team. So I think it's finding that balance. So the self-care part has frankly been part of my journey as I've gone on longer in life and understood that, you've got to, it's that classic, you've got to breathe your own oxygen mask first before you save your child. And so what does that look like in this crisis? Last week we talked about taking the walk in the forest bath, and I think we're going to come through with some more ideas as we go forward, meditation, et cetera. And so having that check-in with your team, like, did you do something for self-care? You could just make that one of, in the standing meeting, just taking a temperature check and making sure, like reinforcing that people need to cut themselves some slack and not just be all crisis all the time.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. I'm sure that maybe some people in the audience have further questions for you, but we just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about some of your lessons learned over time. And a lot of these were extremely practical, and I know that I can draw from them right away with the rest of our teams at Day Health Strategies. And thank you for that. And I'm going to kick it back over to Sarah now.
Yeah, I just thought of one more thing I want to throw in. I think that as tough as crises are, it is amazing. People who've been in the military talk about who are you in the trenches with. There's an incredible moment here where you can really bond with people as you are addressing the crisis response, and you can form friendships with people who you just may never have worked with because you're thrown together to address this situation. So to this day, I've kept in touch with some of the people who were on my initial crisis response team, because you're in the heat, and people say in the heat of battle, and you really do bond, and that the crisis almost forces it forces you to stay focused. So you're basically with that group, and there's, I guess I'm always looking for silver linings, but it is amazing what can come from going through something like this together.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Sarah now.
Sorry, I had muted myself just in case. So if you'd like to ask questions, please put them in the chat. But I have two, since we're waiting for a couple to come in. One is, what was an unexpected hiccup or challenge that you didn't expect when you've been leading through crises in the past? Put you on the spot.
I think it's actually been the opposite, because I was so used to leading and managing in normal circumstances and dealing with internal politics and some of the stuff that comes with organizational life that isn't really the pretty side. And it really goes back in a crisis. A lot of times people will show up with their best self and act and sort of put that other noise aside and just step up. And I think, we're seeing that even in our political landscape, that a lot of people are just saying, oh my gosh, this crisis isn't red or blue. It's like, it's all of us. And I think that's just a almost unexpected bonus that you get. And so the stuff I would have been girding myself for, of like, okay, we have to deal with this situation, these politics, there's less of that, because I think a lot of people are able to set their egos aside and just do what's needed.
Yeah. Yeah. I do have one other question. As I said, I have two. So we're in this situation where all these organizations are adapting to work at home, to, do a lot of things differently. What, in your opinion, is going to stick? We had TSA stick after 9/11, for example. We are still, the way that we run through airports is now different because of that 20 years later. So what do you think is going to stick?
I think that this is going to prove that telework really can work. There were, culturally in a lot of organizations, a lot of folks holding out, and we talked ad nauseum about family-friendly policies and this and that, and it was hard sometimes to move the needle with folks who are like, no, people just need to get to the office and show up, and then I know they're working. So, we have to keep going. And, even in organizations that had that culture so strongly, I've talked to some colleagues who are like, wow, I get to work from home now, and it's like made their life better. That's been a silver lining. They're not commuting. Yes, it's intense at home with small children, and yet they get to be more available in some ways, and they're still getting a lot of work done if they can kind of figure that out with the other folks in the house. And so, I think that's really going to be a shift that we see, that there will be more acceptance of that, and even for the way that we have meetings or conferences to have an option that is a virtual component and not the always you've got to fly there and show up.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so we are 1 minute before the end here, so we're going to move to our motivation.
Do we have any other questions? Okay. Great. Well, keep emailing or chat to us anything you want us to address. I want to leave you with a moment of inspiration. This week is Maya Angelou, and she's a renowned author, poet, actress, singer. She was just a Renaissance woman, frankly, who has passed on, but her words have lived on. And one that we wanted to share this week is that people will forget what you said, they will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And so as you think about leading through this crisis, I just want to encourage you to not worry about having everything figured out. Everything isn't going to be perfect. Some companies working and said, oh, we can't even do glitzy corporate communications. No, you don't need that. What you need is authenticity, showing up for people, telling them the truth, being authentic. That's the important thing, because that's what people are really going to remember. Not every little word, it's how you made them feel. So thank you for attending today. We have one last slide, which is just to remind you how to get in touch with us, and that we will be back next week, April 15th at noon Eastern Standard Time. Hang in there, and thank you again for participating. This will be, it is being recorded, and it will be live on our website shortly.
Thank you.